if this helps. Just so the audio is good for you guys. So just to get back on track, I can't believe this. This is like how the first question that came to my mind is, how on earth is Putin convincing the Russians that they should do this? That how on earth is he convincing everyone in Russia, the popular support, and also the military, the generals? How is he convincing them that no, we're not just going to take over Donetsk and Luhansk, which kind of made sense when you heard that in the news. I never liked it. Good to hear that the sound is back online. Thank you for telling me, Magic Smoke. It kind of makes sense that they would take over these two regions if you're Russian. Of course, for all of us outside of Russia, we all consider Ukraine, and therefore, obviously, you can't invade a sovereign country. It's ludicrous. But if you're Russian, you consider those two regions as held by and controlled by separatists. And these so-called rebel forces are working, or they're at least supported by the Russian government. So it kind of made sense that Russia at some point would come in and try to control those two areas, because you have a lot of Russian-speaking people, especially in those two regions. So it kind of made sense. Like, I could see the logic. If you're Russian, you can kind of convince the Russian people why you would do that if you're Putin. But this, I don't get it. I don't get how you're able to convince the Russian people and the generals, all of the military generals, that this is going to be a good idea. As we'll take a look at later, this has already triggered sanctions, and world leaders like Boris Johnson, I'll show you in a minute, has said that he will put more stricter sanctions on Russia from now on, but he will also potentially begin to aid militarily. By the way, that's a huge statement. I don't know, I'll show you in a minute, but that's a massive statement in terms of, because this is complicated with the whole NATO situation. NATO doesn't really have any rights to influence the whole Ukraine conflict with Russia going in. Ukraine is not part of NATO. It would be different if Ukraine, or if Russia decided to invade Lithuania or Poland or one of these other nations that are part of NATO, but Ukraine is not. So now we're talking about Boris Johnson making statements about sanctions, which you understand, but military actions as well could lead to something much worse than what we're seeing right now for the whole of Europe. Take a look at what this BBC article is saying. They're updating this situation as it goes on during the day, but the most notable thing in terms of how the Russian are able to be swayed into thinking that this is a good idea to take over Ukraine, how Putin is able to convince his generals and the public that this is a good idea. Of course, all of the media in Russia is state-controlled. So keep that in mind when you hear any news from Russia, that it's all state-controlled, and that I think they have a pretty good control over what gets out in the media. So it's rare that you hear anything go against the narrative, and that's what they bring up in this article as well. They say that the majority of media in Russia is state-controlled, which goes some way in explaining why the country's TV channels are presenting the invasion as an act of self-defense, aimed solely at taking out Ukrainian military. So they made the statement with Putin, who addressed the nation this night. He said that this will be very precise strikes against the Ukrainian military. He also threatened any other nation that would interfere with this operation, as he called it. But more importantly, he said that this would be very precise strikes against Ukrainian military targets, which is absolutely crazy. If you see any report, which we're also going to take a look at, you see like cities being attacked and civilian areas and buildings being bombed. So it also says that many channels have been quoting a defense ministry statement stressing that high-precision weapons were being used against Ukrainian military sites with no threat to civilians, which is absolute garbage. That's an outright lie. I myself, I've seen video from people, and there are multiple people on social media that is filming how buildings, civilian areas, how buildings are being smashed. And you see all of these people fleeing. And obviously right now, there's a massive exodus of Ukraine. People are trying to flee the area. I saw in the Danish news this morning that a Danish CEO from who lives in Ukraine, he has his business there. He's trying to flee the area, and he's filming with his phone, and you just see these highways with 4 lanes, and all of the lanes are completely clogged in the direction going out of Kiev, out of the country, to the nearest exit, which is far away. Remember, as I just showed you, remember that if you're in Kiev, you can't go to Belarus. The Russian military has occupied the whole border of Belarus. You have to go to either Poland, Slovakia, or Hungary, or someplace, and we're talking like hundreds of kilometers. This isn't just it's not easy for you to just leave Ukraine like that. Especially when they have shut down all of the civilian airports, they've shut down all of the civilian flights. No one is leaving in just a matter of like 1 or 2 hours. And everyone trying at the same time, millions of people trying at the same time to escape. So you can imagine the border of all of these countries neighboring Ukraine. You can imagine like how you're supposed to process all of these millions of people coming in at the same time. Officials state Russia 1 TV began a news bulletin by saying that today Russia has begun a special military operation aimed at protecting the people who for the last 8 years have been subjugated to abuse and genocide by the regime in Kiev. So the Russian narrative here is that all of these basically Russian citizens that they believe live in Ukraine, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot of Russian people living in Ukraine, or at least descendants living in Ukraine. They are claiming that they've been submitted to a genocide, that the Ukrainian government have been committing a genocide against all of these Russians living in Ukraine. And obviously, if that's true, you can see why a military would step in and try to protect its civilians. But we know for sure it's not true. It would have been all over social media. It's very difficult to hide in a country like Ukraine that there's a genocide going on, and let alone dissidents being targeted or whatever and put in prison. He's talking about genocide here. I think it's getting to a point where you just like, this is an information war, and it's been all along. If you're in Russia, you have a wildly different understanding of what's going on than if you're anywhere in the rest of the West. And I always try to look at both sides, because I don't believe it's a good idea to only look at one side and just be like, I live in the West, therefore I'm right. But in this case, I find it very hard to see why that this would be happening under the nose of everyone. It would be all over social media. Ukraine is not a perfect democracy, but Ukraine is not a country where you can hide a genocide. But of course, this might be much more to do with convincing the Russian people, the Russian military, because you have to understand that most of these military guys, like the young men, they have to believe, like any military, that you're fighting for a good cause. So if you're entering a country, it has to be for a good cause. You can't just enter a country and be kind of the bad guy. It's difficult to convince anyone that that's a good idea. That's a guy saying in the chat, Googling World Economics Forum, Putin is strangely a member just like Biden, and apparently brought under Klaus Schwab, the head of that organization. What are the chances that this is all a theater? That's a very good question. And by the way, keep the questions coming. And that's a very good question. I don't believe this is all theater. Not to get too far off track. And I'll make sure to take all of your comments also in the end of the live stream to make sure to get them all. I don't believe this is theater, because you have people on social media, you have people in the news from different countries who are not all aligned in the same narrative. You have different people reporting kind of the same thing happening. You see explosions in the news in all of these civilian areas. You see these lanes that are clogged up, that are filled with people fleeing. running out of cities, running out of Kiev. I saw a guy filming from Kiev this morning, and he said it's almost like a ghost city, at least the district that he was in. I'm sure a city like Kiev, you can't just evacuate everyone immediately, especially when you have no flights. So this leads me to talk about all of this, all of these sanctions that NATO is beginning to put on Russia. I read an article here from Fox News, the American news media. Where they talk about these sanctions, and I think it's
what happened.
Let me shut this guy off. I think it's very important to understand the reaction of the West to what's going on in Ukraine, because that's going to kind of be the next stage in this conflict. If we are going to see any escalations, if this is going to be something that broadens out to be a conflict that doesn't just involve Ukraine and Russia. And that's the worst case scenario. So the West is most of the world leaders are very careful in the way that they put sanctions on Russia. In one way, you want to be tough. In another way, you don't want to put something that cripples the economy of Russia too much, because then Russia could retaliate. And at this point, when you're already engaged in a conflict, you just don't always know how that looks like. So I had this article from Fox News, and it talks about Jen Psaki, who is the press secretary for President Biden in the White House, and she's asked about these sanctions, if it's going to have any consequences for everyone else. She says here, when she's asked about it, the sanctions that we announced yesterday will not have an impact on the American people. Psaki said they will have an impact on the Russian elite, on financial institutions, on individuals who are trying to use those institutions to engage with Western banks, including President Putin and his inner circle. What we're seeing in the markets is an anticipation for a further invasion by Putin, and what we're trying to do and focus on is take every step we can, working around the world with our counterparts and partners to minimize the impact of the global energy market. So on one hand, she's saying that it's going to have no impact on the American people. By the way, this goes for everyone. If you live in Europe, if you live in the US, the impact is pretty much going to be the same. She's saying that on one hand, it's going to have no impact for all of us, for the American people, for us living in Europe. And at the same time, she's saying that we're trying to minimize the impact on the global energy market. This is crazy. You have to understand, guys, that Russia is responsible for like 50% of all of Germany's energy consumption. They're responsible for a third of all of Europe's energy consumption. They sell tons of oil and natural gases to Europe, and we're talking such a high percent that you're already seeing the stock markets begin to react to the full scale invasion today. It's really crazy. I saw that the Russian stock market fell by 30% today. So that's the stock index, just like the S&P 500 is the stock index of the US. The major stock index of Russia fell by 30% in a single day. So let's talk about these sanctions, because and not in a boring way. Let's try to keep it fresh. I won't get into the nitty-gritty, but I'll talk about what it means and what kind of impact it will have. The way I see it is that Putin looks at these sanctions, and he must have at some point have done some kind of benefit cost analysis, looked at the sanctions and be like, okay, is this going to cost me more than it benefits me if I move into Ukraine? What do I get out of it versus what am I going to lose? And yes, the stock market is down 30% in Russia. But Jen Psaki said in the same interview, I watched the whole press conference, being the geek that I am. I watched the whole press conference, and she said that these sanctions are not meant to have an immediate impact. The same with the European sanctions. They're not meant to be crushing right away. They say that they're meant to be something that crushes the Russian economy over time. Now, the stock market might be down 30%, and that's massive in Russia. But in terms of these sanctions, they're not as tough as every one of these world leaders are saying. We have van der Leyen in the EU. We have Jen Psaki speaking supposedly for Joe Biden, although I'm not sure he really knows what's going on. But supposedly all of these sanctions, like they talk about them as if they're going to be the worst ever for Russia. But in reality, Russia must have anticipated that, first of all, these sanctions are probably not going to be that bad, because otherwise, why would I move into Ukraine? If they're really going to cripple the whole economy of Russia, is it worth it trying to take over Ukraine, even if I know I can, if you're Russian? I don't think it's worth it if it cripples your whole country's economy. So Putin knows that this is going to land somewhere in the middle of the tough words and light sanctions. It won't be light sanctions, but over time he understands that if these sanctions get too tough, if Germany, if France, if the US impose too tough sanctions on my country, I can just retaliate. I can shut off the energy supply to Europe. How about that? By the way, if Putin shuts off the energy supply to Europe, I don't know if you live in Europe, and tell me where you're from in the comment section as well. I'd like to know where you guys are tuning in from. If he shuts off the energy supply to Europe, we're not talking about 30% in stock market crashes. We're talking about you, at the very least, at the very best, we're talking about our cars being filled up for maybe 40% more. It's going to get way more expensive to drive your car. It's going to get way more expensive to heat your house, to have electricity. You can't underestimate how much power that we've let Russia have over us. And that's the main issue here. Putin knows that he has a lot of power. He has much more power over the West than we would like to admit. President Biden has famously shut down a lot of these pipelines, both in the US. How about the Russian pipeline as well? How about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? By the way, I understand why Germany, they announced yesterday that they shut down the progress, at the very least, of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was going to provide a lot of wealth to Russia, but a lot of resources to all of Europe. I understand why they did it, but they have to be very careful in understanding, like, play those dominoes out before you make a decision. I agree with putting sanctions on Russia, and I think it's a good decision to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But understand that they still have the Nord Stream 1. Number 1 is still fully going, and they understand that they can't shut that one down, because if they do, they're going to have much worse issues than a conflict in Ukraine. Especially, it's tragic, it's horrible, but especially if it's isolated to Ukraine, they understand that, listen, we care about Ukraine, but we care about our country's economies as well. They understand that, Putin gets that, and that's why I don't really believe in these sanctions. I want to bring up what Boris Johnson just said, because I found it interesting. I mentioned it a little bit before, just to give you a pretext, that he's talking about these sanctions as well, and we'll listen to the full clip here, the 2 minutes of him talking about this. He's going to talk about the sanctions, but he's also just going to kind of slip in there that they're thinking about military action. And that, my friends, is not something that we should take lightly. Military action, with the UK being a part of NATO, means that NATO would get involved, and it probably means, wherever you're watching from, that your country would get involved as well. Keep that in mind as you're watching this. Check this out.
That for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics. Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. And so I say to the people of Russia, whose president has just authorized a tidal wave of violence against a fellow Slavic people, the parents of Russian soldiers who will lose their lives, I cannot believe this is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status it will bring to the Putin regime. And I say to the Ukrainians in this moment of agony, we are with you. We're praying for you and your families, and we are on your side. And if the months ahead are grim and the flame of freedom burns low, I know that it will blaze bright again in Ukraine, because for all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free. I say to the British people and all who have heard the threats from Putin against those who stand with Ukraine, we will of course do everything to keep our country safe. We're joined in our outrage by friends and allies around the world. We will work with them for however long it takes to ensure that the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine is restored. Because this act of wanton and reckless aggression is an attack not just on Ukraine, it's an attack on democracy and freedom in Eastern Europe and around the world. This crisis is about the right of a free, sovereign, independent European people to choose their own future. And that is a right that the UK will always defend.
All right, that's a right that the UK will always defend. So he knows deep down inside that he's talking about sanctions. He knows that sanctions are the most that the UK and the rest of the West can do right now, because we have no military grounds to enter Ukraine. This won't be a battle fought, a physical battle fought inside of Ukraine. This will be the Ukrainian forces who are, by the way, who are resisting. The Ukrainian forces will, at some point, sadly to say, will get overrun because the Russian military is like the top three, the number 3 in the world in terms of strength. And they just have unparalleled weapon systems and advanced weaponry and all of this. So the Ukrainian forces don't really stand a chance, but they are fighting back according to the reports that I've seen so far. But it leads me to think about what if it came to more than just a confrontation with sanctions? What if this conflict spread out of the Ukrainian borders and it went into multiple countries? First of all, NATO would get involved right away. But if Putin was clever about this, he would begin looking because right now he's invading Ukraine and he's seeing that the West is like all we can do is put sanctions on him. So he must realize, oh, this is like, maybe I just started this out by like to test the waters to kind of find out, is this possible for Russia to take over some of the territory from the Soviet Union to kind of restore the greatness? That must be what he's thinking. And now that he's finding out that essentially we're just putting sanctions on him if he attacks a sovereign country within Europe, by the way, within Europe, he's finding out that the consequences are very mild. Boris Johnson might be talking about military action as well, and that he's ready to defend democracies around the world with whatever it takes. I don't think we really understand the might of the Russian military, and I hate to bring it up that way because obviously they're the bad guys in this situation. But the might of the Russian military, if you combine all of the European countries, we might equal the power, the sheer power of the Russian military, but we're not organized. We're like 40 different countries trying, and we're not united. We don't have like a common goal. I think we have to be careful talking about a military conflict with Russia, not only because of the obvious insane outcome, like a nuclear war, and no one wants to talk about it, but we are dealing with a nuclear power, and you have to be very careful at what level you intervene. So on one hand, you want to do something, you want to make sure that this doesn't just go on, that we don't just sit idle by while we watch Ukraine be completely taken over in some mad dream of Putin's to restore the Soviet Union. You have to make sure you don't just sit idle by and watch that happen. So you throw on sanctions and all of this, but you can't throw words around with military action, because there's no real punch behind your words. Even the UK military, which is one of the biggest ones in Europe, if just not counting Russia, would still not be rivaling anything near what Russia has. And there's no way of kind of uniting the European forces, because not everyone is kind of in the same boat. Like some people and countries are more empathetic to the Russian case, especially in Eastern Europe, than we'd like to think they are. This doesn't go for countries in the Baltic Sea and those countries, but there are other countries that I wouldn't just think that everyone would unite as if the world would be attacked by like an alien attack and everyone unites. I don't think that would be the case at all. I think we're at a place where we know that military action is almost impossible. And I think sanctions is the only thing we can kind of rely on. The only way that military action would be possible is, of course, if NATO gets involved. If Putin decides to expand his campaign with this military strategy, tries to expand into some of these NATO countries. Mind you that almost all of the former Soviet Union member nations are now NATO nations. So they did this very tactically. NATO, of course, was formed to stop the spread of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire after. And NATO quickly in 2004 to 2008, they got a lot of members, new members, like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all nations that have a very strong history with Russia and have a lot of the people I speak with from that region, they resent the Russian influences. So they have a strong distaste, at least some of them, for Russia. And I know there are a good part, just like Ukraine. It's a mixed bag. But in general, I would say that those countries, they don't want anything to do with communism. They've tried it. They don't want to come under the rule of Russia again. So that's why NATO got all of these countries in the same package, and the same with Poland as well. So that's not, to be honest, there's not a lot more that Putin can do in terms of expanding this military campaign, because he's surrounded by either EU countries or NATO countries. I think that's worth keeping in mind in the off chance that NATO gets involved. But I just want to mention that if we find ourselves in a situation where NATO actually gets involved, this means the US as well. And that effectively means World War III. If the US and even Denmark, all of these otherwise peaceful countries, if we all get involved with a conflict, it means World War III. And there's no telling how World War III will look like. But that's a state. There was a quote from was it a general that said, "I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but I know that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." And that's kind of the worst case scenario, that a nuclear war breaks out. So I want our leaders to be careful talking about, military action. Putin made the statement also in the night where he made the statement where he said, anyone trying to interfere with our campaign, hopefully only limited to Ukraine, anyone trying to interfere will be met with a swift show of force. So he's threatening, and he's of course speaking to anyone outside of Ukraine. So he's talking to the rest of the world, NATO, the EU, anyone who could try to interfere. I still can't believe this is happening. I think it's such a crazy situation that we find ourselves in, that Russia is actually right now bombing, trying to get to Kiev. I saw pictures from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and there were like buildings being crushed and explosions in the background. So you already see all of this stuff happening. I just can't believe that that we got to a place where Russia is actually doing this. I didn't think they would. I thought that, you know, because Russia for so long has just been carrying out these provocation attempts, but now you actually you have them with a full scale invasion, and you have to feel sorry for the people of Ukraine. I read this article the other day, like yesterday. It's just a crazy article. It's about how the U.S. is going to the Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He spoke with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Tuesday about Russia's aggression. He basically went to China or spoke with Chinese officials, trying to get them on the side of the U.S. Which, good luck, after you guys are in so many conflicts, a trade conflict, and with everything that's happening right now, the only one benefiting from this conflict with the West fighting against itself, the only one benefiting is China. China is probably, I want to give them some credit and say that I'm sure that they're deeply hurt that the West, the main two competitors they have on the world stage, the two superpowers, Russia and potentially the US, that they're suffering from all of these sanctions that they throw on each other. I'm sure that China is really hurt by it, but really I just think that they're sitting back laughing, and they go like, finally this is happening to the West. Our plan worked. They're beginning to eat themselves. They're beginning to fight amongst themselves. I don't see what the West is getting out of this. I don't see what Putin is getting out of this in the end. I know that he has this dream. He spoke some time ago about having this dream about reuniting the Soviet Union. He said, and someone mentioned this in the comment section. Someone said that Finland should be nervous right now, really worried. And you might go, well, Finland, that's way up here. Like Finland, that's Scandinavia, right? They've got nothing to do with Russia. But actually what Putin, first of all, they have a massive border. They have like thousands of kilometers with Russia right here. This is Finland. Let me zoom out for you guys. So you have Finland here and Russia right here. So they have a massive border with them. Putin said in that address to the nation, I think this is a year ago, he said that the biggest mistake of the last decade was after World War I, Lenin gave up too much territory to Western nations. So actually, some parts of Finland were given to Finland after World War I. And Putin said that that's one of the biggest mistakes throughout the last 100 and almost 20 years by now, like 100 years-ish. He said it was one of the biggest mistakes. And keep in mind, World War II happened, right? The Cold War happened. But he said that was one of the biggest mistakes. If you're Finland, you're probably a little nervous right now. If you're Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia right here, even Poland. I spoke to a Polish guy on this channel, which you can find the video in the videos section. I spoke to him and he said there's this sentiment in Poland, even though that they're pretty far away from Russia, they have this constant sentiment that Russia wants to come back to the former so-called glory of the Soviet Union. And I don't like thinking about where this could lead, where you know, if Putin gets away basically scotch-free, basically without consequences, okay, sanctions, but does he really care about those? I don't like to think about what would happen if he actually tried to move on to another country, because this is where the whole dilemma is. I don't know if I showed you guys before, but I think I still had the camera on me. But this is where the whole dilemma is. You see Finland right here with the border, thousands of kilometers with Russia. The whole dilemma here, of course, is that you have to be tough with Putin behaving like this. You have to be tough on him, but at the same time, what can you really do? And that's why, if you're Russian, if you're convinced about this narrative that that the Russian troops are going in to protect Russians. They're going in to protect them from a genocide, all of this that we mentioned in the beginning of the live stream, then maybe you're inclined to think that, we should take some parts of Ukraine. If it's really like this, if our state media tells us this, it's all we hear from our president. This is an information war, and information is very well contained within Russia. Von der Leyen, who's the kind of the head of the EU right now, has also promised these sanctions because she says because of this barbaric invasion of Ukraine, and she's talking about exactly what sanctions that she's willing to put on Russia, and thereby to hurt the Russian economy. Like, I want to pull up for you guys the Russian stock market. But maybe it's I don't remember the exact name, so sometimes it gets a bit complicated to find. But I think it would show. Let's go Russian stock market. I think it would show you guys, give you a good picture of what's going on. Take a look at this, guys. This is today. Bam. That is, how many percent is that? Is that 30%? Take a look at this. 30, I think it's around, we're talking 35% of the MOEX index. Right now, the Russians are gonna suffer. They're gonna suffer from these sanctions. So we all know that. But the reaction to the stock market is not because of the sanctions, because they already said how these sanctions, Saki said that it's over time that it will hurt Russia. These sanctions will only hurt over time. This is a reaction. What we're seeing on the stock market is a reaction to Russia actually performing this insane invasion into Ukraine. But these sanctions, this is why I want to make this point clearly. This is why I don't believe that Putin fears these sanctions, because he knows that when you have the press secretary of the United States coming out to say, literally, and you can go and watch the press conference, she said that these sanctions won't have any immediate effect. They'll only have effects over time. Then who cares? Who cares if in 1 year Russia will be affected by these sanctions? Who cares if in like half a year Russia will begin to feel some of the economic loss? Putin won't care, because at that point he will have completely taken over Ukraine. And we're not just talking about taking over as in like a theoretical way. We're talking a literal occupation of a whole country that will be annexed and then absorbed into Russian territory. It's crazy. Can you imagine just like a week ago that we would be talking about actually Russia invading, full-scale invading? It's crazy. I've seen some of the reports of these attacks and what they're doing right now, just to make it clear for you guys, so you don't have to read all the news yourself. To make it clear that right now they're committing a lot of these artillery strikes from the border of Belarus into the cities, into specifically these two regions of Ukraine. They're doing the same from the Donetsk and Luhansk region and Crimea as well. They're performing artillery strikes on the anti-air weapon systems that Ukraine has positioned around the borders, near to the border. And that's typically the first step of when you go into war. You try to take out the opponent's anti-air defense system with artillery, and then after that, when you feel confident that the space is cleared, you send in your air force. And the Russian military, as I remember it, has, I think, the third strongest air force in the world. I think they have around 1,000 jets that they can put in place. So just to make the point again, this is not going to be a contest. The Ukrainian military is putting up a fight. They dug in. There are reports about some cities that are being trenched in, where Ukrainian military is taking up positions literally in cities to try to defend the coming Russian onslaught. But But obviously, over time, it will be a brave stance. But I just don't see the Ukrainian forces be able to repel a Russian invasion. It just doesn't make sense to me. But you have to respect the spirit behind defending your country. Imagine if you're one of these young guys. Typically, men who go to war are between 20 and 30, 35 at most. If you're one of these young guys, you're just a teenager, now you find yourself in a conflict in the middle of Ukraine. It's cold, you know that a massive force is coming at you, and all you can do is take up positions, make the best defenses you can, follow the orders. But imagine being in those trenches, being in that city, and you hear reports of the bombings coming closer and closer. It's a horrible situation, and this is happening right in the middle of Europe. It's right next to Slovakia, Poland. It might be Eastern Europe, but it's happening right next door to all of us living in Europe. When we talk war nowadays, it's no longer just this, this like conflict confined within a few hundred kilometers of a radius. This has a potential to spread very quickly. But I hope today, at least today, the one good aspect of social media is that these Ukrainian people are actually able to film what's going on with their own phones and use their social media to make people aware of what Russia is doing to Ukraine right now. Honestly, when I looked at this in the past, I would sometimes be a little bit. I would never be on the side of Russia in this conflict. But when they made the arguments of these areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, when they're controlled by occupation forces, and there's a lot of Russians in there, and people descending from Russians as well, Russian descent, you can see why Putin would want to come in and pretend like these troops were, as he called them, peacekeepers, try to come into the region, take it over, evacuate everyone into safe Russian territory, then retreat. That was the plan. That was the announced plan from the beginning. But now, obviously, you can see that was all a lie. That was just a pretext, maybe to provoke the West. I'm not saying that Putin knew from the beginning that he was going to actually attack Ukraine. I think he waited until this point, when the world was busy with fighting, when the West is busy fighting itself about gender issues and all kinds of things. He looks at the West and now he's like, okay, well, they seem pretty ripe. This is the time for me. Putin is around 70 something years, and this is probably his one chance to become one of those famous Russian generals that took over land for Russia. So I think that's his thinking, that it was now or never. And I think he went into Donetsk and Luhansk, these two regions here, kind of thinking that I'm going to test the waters. I'm going to see what the world does if I do this. If the world reacts strongly, I'm just going to retreat. I'm going to take out all of these Russian people. I'm going to retreat as time goes on. People will forget like they always do. And then we can try again in a few years. But actually nothing happened. We weren't, as the West, we weren't able to do anything against it. We put on some sanctions, but not even Germany. I don't know if you know, but Germany didn't even put more sanctions on Russia because Germany is so deeply dependent on the Russian energy. I think the newest numbers of German dependency on a single country, that is Russia, is 52% of all of its energy. 52%. We're in a situation where we let ourselves be dependent on the one guy who is crazy enough to actually try to invade a massive European country. We made ourselves so dependent on him to the point where now we can't even fight back, at least not all of us in Europe. And the ones that can, is still not fighting back its sanctions. Look, I wanna hear your guys' thought on this, because I don't believe that the US should be the policeman of the world. I don't believe that NATO or anyone else has any technically legal right to interfere in this fight. If you think about it, I'm not. I want everyone to be united, and I want all democracies to thrive. But if you think about it, there's no technical legal right for NATO or EU nations to enter Ukraine in this conflict. And that's kind of the problem. We're at a place where we can't really do anything. I don't like the idea of the US being this policeman of the world. But when you think about it, if you don't have someone like that, if you don't have someone who's able to step in and de-escalate, at the very least, situations before something like this happens, then someone like Putin is free to commit whatever atrocities that's going to happen in Ukraine. As I told you guys earlier, I tried to get in contact with 2 reporters that I know in Ukraine to get them on the channel, have a discussion, have a conversation, let them speak out and just hear their thoughts. But I can't get in contact with them. They went completely off the grid this morning. I haven't been able to contact them. They haven't been on their social media accounts. So right now you can imagine that in Ukraine things are getting dire. I have a video I want to show you, just like a 50-second video from this morning when the air raid sirens began being heard in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine. Let me play this for you guys. This is in Kiev. This is before any attacks happen in Kiev. You can kind of see in the background there's still and you can hear explosions if you can hear over me talking. This is north of Kiev in Ivano-Frankivsk, and another section north of where you obviously, Putin was talking about that these were precision strikes, but obviously what you just saw is all video of civilian areas. This is an attack that happened of a civilian area as well. And by the way, this isn't just one website. This is Euronews reporting this and having this video, but this isn't just one website saying this. It's multiple people, let me pause the video, multiple people on social media as well. So we're not just talking about like, you know, 1 or 2 websites, because a guy mentioned in the comment section, and by the way, give me your thoughts, what you think about all of this in the comment section. I'll make sure to read it all at the end of the live stream and get you guys' opinion. So let your voice be heard. But he was saying that, what are your thoughts on this being some kind of, theater, essentially? That this is, look, I think there's a lot of propaganda going on in the West. Don't be blind just because we live in the West. Please don't be blind to the fact that there's still an agenda. The US is still as power hungry as they've always been. They are, if you listen to US politicians, many of them are longing for this conflict. They are longing for a conflict or even outright a war in Eastern Europe, which is insane when you think about it. It's insane because you know that at some point it could include NATO, and maybe that's what they want all along because war sells. But they seem to be longing for conflict, and every time I just like go facepalm myself and what's wrong with you guys? You don't understand what you're doing, or you understand what you're doing and you're just vicious. Either you mean to profit off of a war, which is even worse, which I'm certainly not saying that's not the case. I'm sure there's a lot of politicians in the US specifically, because they have a whole lobby screaming about how they want a new conflict, they want more war. There's a lot in the US who have been talking in the media as well over the last 2 months that we have intelligence from the intelligence agencies that an attack is imminent. It's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen the next day. And they've been saying that for months. And okay, so now they are right? They ended up being right. And this wasn't, but they've been saying it for months, pumping up this whole narrative that they were going to attack, and I think it's extremely irresponsible. President Zelensky in Ukraine kept saying that, look, until now Russia hasn't done anything. If and when they do, we do want the assistance of the West. But please, guys, just calm down, because you're crushing my country's economy with the way you're speaking about things. That was his appeal to the media in the West, and you just saw them push on for a conflict. So understand that even though we're Westerners, we live in the West, we're Europeans, Americans, there's still an agenda. There's still an agenda. As long as it doesn't happen on the footstep of the US, there's always going to be US politicians longing for conflicts, because they kind of messed up the Middle East enough to a point where no one would be able to get on board with a new conflict in the Middle East, right? This whole Afghanistan debacle, they messed it up. We'll get right back on point in a few seconds. But this whole Afghanistan mess, they messed it up so thoroughly that I think even the US public will not go on board with a new conflict right now in the Middle East. Although I'm sure the US would love a conflict with Iran as well. But getting back to this conflict, I think it's been ramped up in the media for a long time. It was completely irresponsible. It was not necessary. Now we're at a point where they turned out to be true. Not in that they said the next day, but they said that Putin was planning this, that he wanted to go in, and now he's actually done it. I don't think, as to the guy asking, I don't think this is theater. Because for it to be theater, it would have to be, I would imagine that there would have to be a bunch of false flag operations. There would have to be, let's say, the people who are standing to benefit the most from this, the Chinese. Let's say they came in and made a false flag operation. They made it look like the Ukrainians had attacked the Russians, or that the Russians had attacked the Ukrainians, and then Ukraine, in a response, attacked back. That could have been a false flag operation, but that doesn't look to be the case. Then I could have been on board with you, that it could have been a theater, all of this. But to me, it looks like a genuine invasion, that Russia had this planned all along. The Belarusian president, Lukashenko, is saying that he's more than willing to support the Russian troops if the Russian troops are not enough. He made the newest statement that he made, to be fair, is that he said Belarusian troops won't be going in with Russian troops, but they never needed to in the first place. Russia doesn't need Belarusian, like 100 Belarusian troops. It's not needed, but it does speak to where Belarus is as a European nation as well. Remember that Belarus has a very complicated history with Russia, but they right now are hosting the Russian forces that are all placed. The artillery are placed on the line of Belarus, the border with Ukraine, bombing all of these places. And of course, you have artillery that can shoot. If it's placed here, they can fire with, I'm assuming, like 50 kilometers into Kiev. So you hear, when I showed you that video just a little earlier in the live stream, you hear these bombs go off in the background. And those are not like hundreds of kilometers away. Those sound like they're pretty close. I don't know, guys. I just think that we're getting to a point where the worst case scenario kind of happened. And now, of course, we need to contain this conflict. And I hope these world leaders are willing to do what it takes. I'd like your suggestion. Like, give me your suggestion in the comment section of what you think could help alleviate this conflict. Because I'm not sure I see an easy solution. NATO can't really do anything. They can't step into Ukraine. These sanctions, they might have like a long-term effect on Russia. But obviously, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about this long-term effect enough to stop this invasion. So I'd like your opinion on all of this, on anything I mentioned so far, but especially also, is there any solution? Is this essentially Ukraine losing its country to Russia? The world might be very slow to recognize Ukraine being part of Russia. I just think that with time, people tend to forget all of these conflicts, and we all do. Like I do as well. You forget what happened in Libya, what the CIA did in Libya. You forget all of these conflicts, and then as time goes on, you just accept the new normal. No Ukrainians are going to accept the new normal in Ukraine, but will the rest of the world? That's going to be the key issue in terms of finding out if this whole conflict will actually be forgotten in history, and Ukraine just be absorbed into Russia. I'm very interested to find that out. As I said, I just think that China is the only one sitting back enjoying this situation. They say what they need to say, right? They say like all of the diplomatic things. They hope there's a de-escalation. They hope there's no aggression. But I'm sure that they are sitting back and laughing their butts off. So let's go to the comment section. I want to make sure that I get all of your comments to go along. We already talked about the theater question. Is this all theater? I like what you're saying, though. I like the Klaus Schwab comment because it speaks to the Great Reset as well. And the Great Reset is something that I always wanted to dive more into on the channel. It's always a matter of choosing between would you do the current or would you do the more permanent Great Reset issue. We talked about Finland, how they're pretty nervous right now. Finland is a neighbor. We consider them neighbors of mine. You know, I'm from Denmark, so Scandinavia up here. Finland has this, as we talked about, this long border and this complicated history where after World War I, Finland gained some ground, gained some areas in their country from Russia. And that's what Putin said in a speech, that he wanted, he thought that was a massive tragedy, that he would try to rectify that situation if at all possible for the Russian Federation, as he said. So, of course, after watching what's happening in Ukraine, you're worried if you're Finland. You're worried if you're anyone in Europe. If like Denmark, I know it's all over the news. So, of course you're worried. Let's see. How can we know what we are to believe, says Magic Smoke? World leaders are interested in preserving their own power, and all of them gaslight their own populations. Well, that's a really, you know what? That's a really good point. And I love that observation, because that's a big part of why I'm doing this whole channel, because I want to take in news sources from different sides. And I want to, you know what? I want to have a Russian on my channel and hear their opinion, how they view this whole conflict, and try to set things straight with them. Not necessarily try to correct them, but just try to find out why, like, how do you see this conflict? I have friends, I live in Denmark, but I have the privilege of having been a part of a very international environment. So I have a lot of friends who are from like Latvia, Estonia, all over the place in Europe, essentially. And also Eastern Europe. And I know that there's a few of my friends who are from Latvia, but they are actually Russian of descent. They have parents who come from Russia, and they have some affinity to Russia as well. And they talk about how, you know, actually in Russia, Putin is well liked. I know all of the opinion polls are skewed because, I mean, Putin can do whatever he wants, right? But actually, my friends are saying that, yeah, I find this interesting because on one side, I hear the Western narrative, as Magic Smoke is bringing up. There's a narrative from each side, but they also have the Russian narrative, and so they have one ear on each side, and they find it hard to find out what's the truth, because this is an information war. If you hear something from one side, for the West, it's so clearly the Russians are the bad guys, and that's the side I'm on as well. Just to be clear, you know, I don't want to make it sound like I'm empathetic now that Russia fully moved into Ukraine. To me, it's so crazy, it's insane. But Russia has its own narrative, and you can't underestimate that the propaganda machine of every country are very efficient. I think even if we believe the Western narrative, I think you and I can both agree that if we believe the Western narrative completely in terms of the Middle East for the last 20 years, then you would have been someone who would have been a fool after the fact, because they've been lying to us for so long, especially about wars and natural resources. So be mindful that every time, as Magic Smoke is saying, that every time we have these conflicts, everyone has their own narratives. Everyone's trying to get their own story out. And this even, like, you can't even say the West, because the US has its very own narrative as well, compared to Europe. Europe, I consider pretty peaceful in general, pretty neutral in the way they bring news, but they still have a lot of state-sponsored news stations. But the US, depending on the party in charge, if you have Democrats, if you have Republicans in charge, the narrative shifts a lot. You always have the feeling of that there's this beast of the permanent state that's underneath the two parties in the US that constantly want more war. They are very much intertwined with the war machine, with these companies that sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. Europe does this as well, by the way. Europe keeps selling weapons to Saudi Arabia as well, and that's one of the areas where we keep condemning all of these sanctions that we talk about. We condemn the sanctions, we condemn these weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, but then at the same time, we say that we'll put sanctions on them if we do it, and we're talking about France, the UK, Germany, Italy, and so on. But at the same time, they send these massive weapons deals to Saudi Arabia every single year. So it's worth to keep in mind that it's finding the truth in the middle of all of this is always difficult. It's so rare that one side gets all of the truth. But that's why I did this channel. That's why I really like talking with you guys. I know I also have a few Russians on the channel. I have a few Ukrainians. And just to see you guys' comments, it really brings a lot to me. And that's why I love to have this channel to talk with you guys as well. All right, let's move on to the next one. Do you think Putin will get pushback from within his own regime? See, that's why I know that the propaganda machine in Russia has to be really effective for Putin not to get any pushback. There has to be pushback within his own regime. Actually, I was watching this very interesting, let me see if I can find it as I speak here. I was watching this video yesterday of Putin, where he was in front of his whole administration. So you have the spy leader of Russia, you have all of these Russian officials. And let me see if I can find it. But actually, the spy general, the leader of the FSB, the intelligence services of Russia, openly said on the stage in front of Putin, he said that he was very hesitant in supporting. Putin was asking him, do you support us taking over these regions? Do you support the sovereignty of Russia within this region, within Ukraine? And he was very hesitant. It didn't look like he wanted to say it. He looked like a dog that had been beaten a little too many times. But then he ended up saying, yes, I fully support you, Mr. President. But that's probably the closest you're going to get to a full-out rebellion. I'm sorry, guys, I can't find it right here. But that's probably the closest you get to a full-on rebellion within the Putin regime, because it's so tightly controlled. I think he'll get pushback for sure. I think there's a lot of Russians sitting out there right now thinking, what the crap is going on? We are invading Ukraine. We're not just going in to extract the population that feels Russian, to kind of implement them into our society, to save them from these separatists in those small regions, in the regions in eastern Ukraine. We're not just going in to help them out. We're actually invading the whole country. It's difficult to say, man. I think the Russian narrative is clearly that not only that there's a genocide of Russians within Ukraine, but that Ukraine itself is not really a nation. Putin said some time ago that we don't consider Ukraine a nation because the Soviet Union built up Ukraine. He said that in a TV interview right before he attacked the two regions a couple of days ago. He said that they're basically not a country because we built them up. They used to be Soviet Union territory. Then we built them up as a nation and we called them a nation, but they never really were. They're filled with Russians. There are Russians everywhere. So that's why we should be able to come in and try to take over some areas. I think the Russian narrative is so strong, maybe not with the population, but with the generals and the intimidation of standing out and speaking up against. I think the cost is too big for there to be any real populist movement or even generals really stepping out, saying anything against Putin in this case. You see what's happening to reporters that disappear all the time in Russia. I don't think there'll be that much of a pushback, Tony, as you are asking about. KLH Arts is saying exactly. Thank you for pointing that out. That's true. NATO talks was a taboo. Now they talk about it. Yeah, exactly. The whole NATO and the whole issue of Ukraine being implemented into NATO is also a very, very contentious issue. Obviously, as I remind you, NATO was created to stop the Russian expansion after World War II, after the Soviet Union. They created NATO to stop the Russian expansion. They said no more of the Soviet Union. We need an international organization militarily that can protect all of the member nations. So everyone who wants to come on board, just jump right in. Back then, Ukraine were still very pro-Russian. And it's only in more recent times that Ukraine has talked about becoming a member of NATO. But of course, Russia will say that this is what prompted this whole conflict, that Ukraine wanted to be part of NATO because NATO is by definition anti-Russia. It's why it was created, even though people kind of forgot over the years and it grew and all of this. The fear of the Russians taking over smaller countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on, like here on the map, the fear is constant. The fear is that, because it's only a few generations ago, so the fear is still there that Russia could do this again. So that's why in 2004 to 8, as I remember it, those countries began joining NATO as well. Ukraine was the most recent one, talked about joining NATO, but there's been so much controversy around it because Russia is effectively in control of Belarus now. So they have this huge land area right next to their own borders where they potentially could defend against an invasion from whoever would invade Russia. You know, the country is massive. It's the biggest country in the world. So they have this land area, but of course they don't want to give up this whole Ukrainian land area. One of the big reasons they took over Crimea in 2014 was that they wanted an entry point into the Black Sea. The Black Sea, which of course leads to the whole Mediterranean Sea as well, and thereby leads to global trade. Russia is missing out on a lot of that because they do have this. I don't know if you know. This is a fun, interesting fact. I don't know if you know, but Kaliningrad. I'm probably saying that wrong, murdering the name. But Kaliningrad is Russian. Actually, this little piece of land right here, you might go like, is that Poland? Is that Lithuania? No, it's actually Russia. Russia owns this little piece of land. And up until recently, until they took over Crimea, that was their way of getting closer to international trade with waters, but also to have like submarine bases, naval bases, and so on. So of course they don't want to give that up, but the problem for Russia is that they didn't have any clear land connection to this area. Now, if they have Ukraine, if they have Crimea, not only do they have access to world trade on sea, but they also have access to military bases where they could deploy a navy much more effectively than if they had to do it way up here north. By the way, one of the problems for Russia is that most of the year this massive body of water is frozen solid. You have no way of really of leaving Russia on this side. So of course Russia has a very high degree of protecting Ukraine, so-called protecting Ukraine, from going into becoming a member of NATO. Once they become a member of NATO, think about this. If this is another point, if you're Russia, think about this. If Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, the US has its legal rights to put weapon systems right on the border of Russia. If Ukraine became a member of NATO, the US could easily put troops right on the border of Russia. So you can understand why Russia would invade, but you can understand why Russia would not allow Ukraine to become a part of NATO. They would do almost anything for that not to happen. It would kind of be the same as if Mexico and Russia made a federation, and Mexico agreed that, you know, we can just put like troops on the border of Mexico, Russian troops. The U.S. would come down on Mexico so hard that that would probably be no tomorrow for Mexico if that happened. All right, let's move on. The U.S. missile racks are fully restocked. They need to shift some of them. Good morning to you, Wisco. How's it going? Tuljin is saying that no election of that scale with a result so slanted so heavily toward the incumbent is reliable, especially for a president for life type leader. Yeah, you're right. We talked about this, and you're completely right. No election, you can't really consider an election a real election if you have them like they do in Russia right now, where you do have other names like Alexander Navalny, the opposition leader to Putin, one of the biggest opposition leader for a long time to Putin. Actually, I think was on the ballot on the most recent election, but it was very clear that if you voted for him, your vote would get lost or it wouldn't be counted quite as effectively as if you voted for Putin. And also Navalny later on, if you followed the whole case with Navalny, he got poisoned with this Novigrad toxic, which was used in the Soviet Union era. So there's a lot of people saying that obviously the Russian government poisoned him, that the Russian government essentially doesn't do fair elections, and Putin always no matter how bad and poorly he does in a certain, year range, he always gets like 70, 80% approval, 80% of the votes coming in for him. So yeah, I agree that you can't really call an election valid. At least that's the narrative that I agree with. Wisco is saying that, narrative is that Putin feels like Ukraine is not a country. I try to think about it, and I understand there are many Ukrainians who still feel the impacts of the USSR and talk Russian. But come on. Totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. It's not an excuse. You can't use that as an excuse to enter a sovereign country. Listen, the past is the past. You can't live in the past. You can't just selectively bring it up and be like Putin and say, Ukraine used to belong to us. Actually, we built up Ukraine, which I think some parts of that is true. I think Ukraine had a lot of help from Russia when it was being built up. Russia used it. It's called the breadbasket of Russia. Russia used Ukraine for resources for a long time, and I'm sure they helped build it up effectively. So I'm sure it's the case that Ukraine was somewhat built up by Russia as well. But you just can't use it as an excuse. You can't be like, in the past we owned this nation or we built it up. Now it belongs to us, by the way. I know 50 years passed. I'm still gonna invade anyways. It would kind of be the same. I don't know if you know anything about Viking history, but I do because I'm Danish. And it would kind of be the same to say that, well, Denmark, once actually we owned a big part of the UK because we raped and pillaged our way through like a good 3 or 4 centuries. So now actually the UK, you should surrender to us, right? It would be the same as if Denmark said, we need Norway, we need Sweden, we need a little bit of Finland as well. Not to go too much into Viking history on this live stream, but that would kind of be the same thing. It's I know the history is more recent with Russia and Ukraine, but the principle is kind of the same. Although I'm not sure we would want Finland and Sweden. I'm not sure, because then we get very close to Russia. All right. Julian is saying that the parallels with 1930s Germany and Austria, Czechoslovakia are huge. People don't want to compare everything to Hitler, but come on, so obvious. Listen, I actually thought about that, and I don't think I brought it up in the live stream. I don't think I mentioned it, but that's a really good point, Julian. I'm sorry if I don't say that right. But I think that's a good point. What Hitler did so effectively, as I remember it, was that he would make agreements with countries. Then he would slightly break the agreements. He would make a bunch of agreements with all the different countries around Germany. A bunch of different countries at the same time. Then he, one by one, he would break a little bit of one agreement with one country, invading just a small part of the country and then taking them over completely. That's why Germany, which is just one country, was so effective and able to take over such a big part of Europe. Because one by one, and obviously back then they didn't have social media, they didn't have the news to the same extent. I mean, the press was there, but you didn't have it in the same extent. So word didn't get around fast enough. Before, when people realized what was happening, it was already too late. Wisco saying that Mexico analogy was great. Yeah, but that's what I mean. That when I think about it, we've become so ingrained with this narrative of the West that when I thought about it one day, and I'm like, wait a minute, would we love it? Would the US love it? Would they tolerate it? If Mexico said, listen, we're going to make a federation with Russia. And by the way, when we make a federation, it's not just going to be like trade organizations and stuff. It's also going to be militarily, that Russia can send however many troops and artillery and whatever they want to the borders of Mexico. No, there's no chance. The US would be all over that. Julian is saying that Germans in Austria, etc., was the excuse back then. Yeah, and that's a good point as well. And it kind of goes to the same thing, that they always had, like Germany, in Nazi Germany, had this excuse that, well, we have people, we have Germans living in the country. Kind of the same excuse that Putin is using right now. And I remember reading that actually Putin, at the end of the Second World War, actually Putin was working in I think it was Dresden in Germany, but he was somehow in Germany doing Russian intelligence, as he's always done. And I'm sure that he learned a few tricks from the history, for him, the recent history of what just happened in Germany. Why Germany failed, because they came very close to conquering Europe. They had these insane ambitions that they began going into North Africa as well. They began going into like the northern parts of Africa after they had taken over big parts of Italy and different places. And obviously their ambitions got the better of them. But that's a very interesting point. This morning, KLH says, this morning, some analyst accidentally nearly referred to Putin to Hitler. He said, Heil. He said Hitler Putin. He didn't say Heil Putin. He said Hitler Putin. Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of confusion because if you know a little bit about history, and I'm not a history channel. I talk about current events and what's going on, but I'm sure if you know a little bit about what's gone on in European history, you begin to see the similarities of what's going on here. The difference is that today I just don't think it will work. I think people will have, like the media and social media, I think people have a much better way of spreading news. Of as soon as someone does something outrageous, a lot of reactions just come pouring in on social media. And in the end, it doesn't really matter, I guess, if NATO can't do anything, if the EU are unable to do anything as well. In the end, it doesn't really matter, right? So in that way, I can see why people are saying that. But to me, it does give you a hope that that this escalation won't go any further, that it won't spread to more countries. It's a pretty crazy situation, guys. Let me just get this. Magic Smoke is saying that the US would never ever accept a bordering country that is militarily aligned with Russia. To that extent, the Americans are being very disingenuous. I totally agree. There's no chance. And by the way, isn't it funny? I don't mean to go into politics that splits people too much, because I don't want to add to all of the noise and the splitting of our societies into political groups. Because I think that's actually, when we don't get into it right here, but I think that's what China wants the most. Don't you think that China looks at the US right now and they see the divide of the two political parties, of people being so divided politically, that to a point where there's almost little common ground? Don't you think that China is happy, at the very least happy that's happening? At the very worst, they're behind some of it, right? So no, I don't think the US would allow any kind of Russian alignment with Mexico or Canada, for that matter. Not that they would, but there's no chance that the US would allow that. That's just no chance. And they are being disingenuous because they worry a lot about the Ukrainian border, which I'm happy about. I'm happy that the Ukrainians are getting financial aid from the US. They're getting some weapons as well from the US. I'm happy about all of that, but they need to worry about the Mexican border as well. The Mexican border, what is happening there is destroying a good part of the US as well. The old line was, the Germans marched into Poland backwards and told them they were leaving, said the West supported Hitler greatly before he mobilized, says Niels Cook. Yeah, that's the old joke, I guess. The Germans marched into Poland backwards and told them they were leaving. Yeah. And there's a lot of resentment from Polish people for Russians doing all of this. I spoke with recently on my channel, which if you haven't watched it, it's a very interesting conversation with a Polish guy, one of my friends. I had a conversation with him talking about how great is the fear of Poland. Because I talked with him when Russia and Belarus were carrying out these military joint operations called the Zapad 2021 in Belarus, and they were happening right in this Brest region area, which is bordering Poland. So of course he was very worried that this could lead to something, because you had a bunch of Polish military on the border to make sure that everything was in order. And you can only imagine that if someone does something stupid, then that quickly escalates. That was my worry with the whole Ukrainian border crisis back just a week ago, when it was the Russians on the border and the Ukrainian forces on their border. That was my worry, that someone would do something stupid, or someone would do a false flag operation that, let's say, I'm not saying I know this for a fact, but let's say that China did a false flag operation, making it look like they attack each other. All of a sudden there's a response, and then there's another response to that from the other side, and on you go. All of a sudden you have a war, you have a great conflict. So that's for sure, that's a good point. Magic Smoke is saying that I think we need to dig deeper for the true motivation. Everything seems to be about energy and pipelines, namely interests. Listen, that's such a good observation. I need to do videos more about the deeper motivations of what's going on in Europe. Because if you take a map, I'm sorry I can't do it for you guys here, but if you took a map and drew the pipelines, these oil pipelines, first of all, you take a map and draw one in the Middle East, and you'll find out country for country, year for year, the countries that the US had conflicts with were the next country in line that the US would need for a new pipeline to be established all the way to Israel. And now I'm very pro-Israel, and I'm fine with you if you aren't. It's, you know, you can always debate things, but if you look at this pipeline that they're building, supplying natural gases and resources from the Middle East, if you look at all of the countries that the US invades year by year, it almost fits with when they built this pipeline. So it goes hand in hand. And that's why I think Magic Smoke is bringing up that sometimes there's many deeper motivations for all of these conflicts and these wars that we see. And, you know, you have a bunch of young guys going to war, going like, yes, because America, we're going to liberate Iraq. We're going to free up Afghanistan. We're going to bring democracy. We're going to bring democracy to the Middle East. Because that worked so well the last like 15 years we tried it. We were successful every single time, so now we're gonna try it again. No, it's that's deeper motivations, and you, Magic Smoke, you're totally right. I need to get into the deeper motivations and do videos for you guys talking about that, because that's where the really fascinating stuff is taking place. The Great Reset, it's not a coincidence. It's not a conspiracy either. I know there's a lot of news outlets talking about the Great Reset being a conspiracy theory. That is essentially just people making things up. But no, it literally isn't. We're talking about people like Klaus Schwab, who someone mentioned in the comment section earlier. We're talking about someone like that who literally has a plan for the destabilization of the West and how we need to reset currencies. We need to have a global community. We need to have a global currency. All stuff that is very, very dangerous. I know it's very hip. I'm sure maybe some of you guys watching are very much in favor of it. And you guys are always welcome on my channel. I just because you have different opinions, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't get along. It's one of the lessons of this time that we need to get along in spite of our differences. We talk it out. We try to find middle ground, and then we just we're still friends. Like, it's all good. I still love you guys. Hopefully you guys still love me. It's we can disagree on things, but finding the deeper motivations for why all of these things are happening, I think is a very, very good point, and I'll begin to make videos on that even more, because there's always deeper motivations going on with all of these conflicts. There's always companies, something we don't really talk about, are companies behind these conflicts. Massive military industrial complex companies that are producing weapons en masse. They're producing weapons all over the place. They're selling them every time there's a conflict, sometimes to both sides of the conflict. I'm tempted to go into the whole Yemen crisis, because it's such an obvious example of the whole of Europe selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. And Europe, the EU, has clear restrictions against selling weapons to nations that are involved in human rights violations, which is clearly happening in Yemen. And still so it's condemned in the EU. They constantly have these what do you call them, like embargoes and sanctions against deals happening with European companies to Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, the European governments are profiting off of these companies in their countries selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. It's complete. That's always a deeper motivation. And as Magic Smoke is saying, it's often money, energy. It's about these pipelines. That's a really good observation. So thank you for that one. Do you think there are a lot of Russian agents trolling YouTube? It feels like it. I know people have exaggerated that I've been called a Russian bot before, but why wouldn't they have agents? Yeah, I think, listen, this happens a lot in the news. There's a lot of news about the US saying that Russia, but the last election, I'm not talking about the 2021, I'm talking about the 2016. Ever since that election, the US politicians have been all about Russia is the worst enemy that we have. We have to. Do you remember all of the Russia stuff with Trump? That turned out, some of his associates had some dealings with Russia, which they shouldn't have. But that wasn't the premise. The premise was that Trump was in the pocket of Putin, that he was doing the bidding of Putin. And for 4 straight years, I sat here and I had to listen to news medias telling us with a straight face, and they never apologized after this. After 4 years, I had to listen to this with a straight face that Trump literally was an agent of Putin carrying out the will of the Kremlin. And it was so absurd to anyone looking just a little deeper. But it tells you that politicians are willing to follow a narrative that comes from somewhere. And where it comes from, we should look into. I have a good idea. Because especially the US politicians, European politicians have a lot of rules against this in general. But US politicians become filthy rich when they're in office. I think Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, gets $200,000 a year, but her total net worth is up to $300 million. How do you get that rich? You go to speaking arrangements, and these companies, they pay you, like Hillary Clinton. These companies, they pay you millions of dollars to speak at the company. You're that interesting. Hillary Clinton can you imagine Hillary Clinton entering the stage and everyone in the audience just going, you know what, guys, I know you have your prejudices, but this is going to knock your socks off. This is going to be the best speech, the most clever speech that you've ever heard. It's just crazy. I don't believe it for one bit. These politicians that get rich, they get rich from somewhere. And it's not just donations. It is donations, but it's not from people. It's from companies primarily. And that's where you need to go if you need to begin to look at the narrative and why are so many of these conflicts happening. Very good point, Magic Smoke. I spent a little too long on that, so let's move on. It's something that I really want to take into account. And also Tuilin for bringing up that these bots could be placed. But I just think that many countries do this. I don't think it's specifically Russia. I think China does it as well. I don't know about the US. I don't think the US needs to, because remember that the US has most of these technological companies in Silicon Valley. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these places are owned by essentially US companies. And they enforce a narrative that's very closely knit with the US government. So I think the US has this advantage that they don't really need bots to enforce a certain worldview. They can just tell the media companies, like they've done over the last 2 years with the pandemic, they can just tell media companies, look guys, you guys need to push out this narrative. And then voila, magically, all of a sudden, it's forbidden to talk about certain things. You can't criticize certain pharmaceutical companies that are otherwise getting like multi-billion fines every year for doing, faulty research or whatever. You can no longer question stuff like that. So in terms of bots, I don't think that the US needs them. I think China and Russia for sure does it. Those are probably the biggest parts or countries using AI to manipulate people's opinions, in my view. Yes, China is doing well with the fracture of USA. So yeah, Niels Cook, for sure they are. They're loving this. Look, China has been taking over more and more, especially in Africa. And I want to do more videos on this, but it's always a matter of finding the time for it. But China's been taking over. By the way, don't forget Eastern European countries as well. Ukraine, Romania, they are all, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they're all of these. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to my map, but I'm guessing that you guys can see it. But here it is. Like Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, they're all deeply in debt to the Chinese regime. You can't underestimate what it means to take money from China. And this is a big issue, that when some of these countries are trying to come back from poverty or from being decimated over the last few decades, they are trying to come back, but they need money. None of these European banks are willing to lend them money because they think the risk associated with lending the money is too big. So what do? They go to China. They go to the Chinese, I don't remember the names of the bank, but China has this massive bank that lends out money to nations that need them to rebuild, for infrastructure, for projects. And on the surface of it, it's actually very nice. It's actually very good. But if you look deeper at it, you quickly find out that many countries are deeply in debt to China, to the point where China is now beginning to require, instead of, because they can't pay back this money, right? The interest rates keep going up and China keeps lending out more money. And when they say, look guys, it's time to pay up, then China is ready, and they won't just allow the countries to push out payments. So what they do is they actually take over chunks of companies, or whole companies, especially in Africa and those small island nations surrounding in the South China Sea surrounding China. They take over all of these nations. There's a nation, the name escapes me right now, but it's a set of islands right under the South China Sea, and it's been completely taken over. Its ownership has gone to China, and that's kind of the model that you have to be very aware of when we're dealing with China. That's why it's super dangerous for Ukraine. And Ukraine did this as well. Now that we're talking about Ukraine, they did this as well. But this is happening. This is happening all over Africa. Major parts. I have a friend who's from Zambia. Major parts of Zambia is being controlled by China. So to the point where you're beginning to see Chinese companies' names on buildings. They own some of the news channels in Zambia and different African countries. You got me off track a little bit, but you can't underestimate how much China is loving this, the fracture of the U.S., as Niels Cook says. Both sides of the U.S. politics are equally hawkish when it comes to the military. There is little distinction, says Magic Smoke. And I totally agree with you. There's almost no distinction when it comes to. I can't tell the difference when they speak about war, if it's a Republican or a Democrat. I have no idea who's talking, if it's either one. I totally agree with you. There's no distinction. China runs social media propaganda farms. I'm sure Russia would too. Yeah, and we went into that totally. I'm sure China and Russia does the same thing. Including Syria, that is what the Syrian conflict is about. So I'm not. Listen, I spoke with a politician from Turkey on this channel recently. The interview is on the channel as well. It was really interesting, and she was speaking about Syria as well, and how they're being influenced, and how the whole conflict, again, as Magic Smoke said, that there's a deeper motivation behind the conflict. What we see in the news is refugees pouring into Europe. That's what we get in the news, but they don't talk about like is someone pushing the refugees? Did someone create this because they wanted more refugees to come into Europe to destabilize a certain part of the world? Is that someone's plan? I'm not going to go into it here because when I do these videos, I have to find out exactly what YouTube allows, because they'll strike you and take down the channel really fast if you go into stuff they don't like you talking about. Hello, my old friend, says Frank. Hey, Frank, it's really good to hear from you. It's been a long time. I hope you're doing well, man. I'm really happy to hear from you. Frank is one of my earliest subscribers. I remember when I began doing videos, which are horrible. If you ever want to laugh and have like I guess a funny time on my expense, just go back and watch one of my earliest videos. But Frank the Tank was there in the very beginning. So very nice to hear from you, Frank. I'll read your comments right after this. Right war equals pipeline. Same narrative. Maybe Putin does this, but on a lesser scale. Yeah. Listen, for every war and every narrative that you hear about in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, but mostly in the Middle East, for every war that you've heard about from the media in the West, Russia has been there right along with them. And they have some of the same goals as you say, pipelines and stuff. They have the exact same goals, because Russia is like the second biggest exporter of natural gases in the world. They don't just get that from Russia. They get it from the Middle East as well. I remember going to get a pizza downtown. I was speaking to this guy owning the pizza place. He was from Afghanistan, and he had fled to Denmark. He had come here, and he said that there was a conflict, this whole Afghanistan crisis that just happened like some time ago, with all of the refugees and us fleeing Afghanistan. I'm saying us because Denmark was part of it. We had troops in Afghanistan as well. We were fleeing, and I asked him, so how do you feel about this Afghanistan crisis? Are you really mad at the US? Because I knew he had come here some time ago, fleeing war. And I asked him, are you mad at the US? Like, does it create a lot of anger? And he said, no. No, the US is fine to me. I said, but didn't you flee war? And he said, yeah, but it was the Russians. It was the Russians before the US. The Russians were in Afghanistan. They're in all of these countries just as much as the US is. You might have heard about the Blackwater Group, which is a private mercenary army that the US military uses to carry out a lot of operations that are, let's say, shady. The Russian government has something called the Wagner Group, which is ex-Russian military people carrying out all of these missions that the Russian government can't be tied to. So yes, they have a lot of, and they act out a lot of these proxy conflicts in the Middle East and so on. So yeah, they have a lot of the same. They have a lot of the same missions. Is all politics a bunch of oligarchies? Is that how you say it? Oligarchies. I think that's how you say it. Who are looking to gain, and the common folks who will suffer. Isn't that true? That's always true for when we send people to war. When we send people to, yeah, totally true. Every single time we send people to war, that's a good saying that in war, the young die and the old get rich. And that's how it always is. There's always this shallow idea that, I heard a soldier talk about this the other day on the Joe Rogan podcast. There was a soldier talking about, he was 18 when he was sent to war. 18 or 19, he said it was a teenager. He went to war, he came into this conflict where he had to fight in the Middle East. He had to fight against this person. He said you could just see that he was some kind of Middle Eastern person, long beard, pretty big physically. They got into a fight, he lost his weapon, and he ended up having to kill him. But he said that you could see from those conflicts and all of this that they don't think that they're wrong, the people that we're fighting against. And we don't think that we're wrong when we attack some Middle Eastern country in the name of democracy, in the name of instituting democracy, or whatever they say, whatever shallow reason they give to take the natural resources of all of those regions. It's you're right. It's all the same. It's totally all the same. Hillary made it up. Hillary made a lot of things up. I don't miss those times, but the times with Trump and Hillary doing their campaigns, but I just thought so much of it was so funny. Like sometimes I talk with people about Trump, and I don't want people to support Trump, especially if you don't. I'm completely good with all of that. But I just thought it was such a funny time. It was such a funny time when Trump would go at Hillary and she would completely overreact, or she would to me it was just funny. I understand that we're dealing with a future president, but I just, as a European, I just had a lot of fun. Also during Trump's presidency, I thought it was, and by the way, none of this happened during Trump's presidency. That might just be a coincidence, because as we just talked about, when you have a president, it's not the person deciding everything. You have this permanent political structure under the president that never goes away. Depending on what president comes and goes, the permanent political structure never goes away. That's why you have the same plan for the Middle East and the wars for so long. But so the president, like, how much can they really do? But they can stop wars. So many times Trump could have gotten into a war like Syria in the Middle East or any other nation, but he didn't actually start any new wars. You can find a lot of things that Trump did wrong, but he did a lot of good. And this thing with Ukraine didn't happen under Trump. I wonder what he would have done in this situation. I wonder if Biden is even aware of what's going on. Like truly aware. When I see him, and this is not to just pile on one side of politics, but when I see Biden, forget about Trump, just look at Biden alone. When I see him read off his teleprompter, all I see is someone who's reading a pre-planned script, which I don't delude myself into thinking that Biden is the one who sits there and writes the whole speech every single day before he gets on. I just don't think so. All right, let's move on. Let's take a few more comments, and I need to wrap up this stream. It's been almost 2 hours. I can't believe it. You guys been so awesome. I'll still take the few comments that are left for sure. I'm really grateful that you guys have been watching. You guys are why I do this channel. You guys watching are the reason I love to check out the news, find all the sources, bring them together, and talk with them about you guys. So I'm really thankful for you guys who are joining the stream and spending your beautiful Thursday it's Thursday, right? Afternoon. I get the days confused because I work as a trader on my own thing all the time. So sometimes I get the days confused. Let me see. So where were we? Clinton would already be in prison if the judicial system was Good point. I remember James Comey went on stage and he was like, he basically changed the laws of a crime or the wording of a crime to make it fit so that Hillary didn't really commit a crime. Yeah, totally agree. But then again, if you were to hold all presidents accountable for their war crimes, I think everyone would be going to jail. Imagine trying to track every fallacy made in political history. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. You can't listen, and that's why at some point it's like when you make a decision in life, let's say about anything, like about God or about anything, you go into an argument you don't really know in the beginning. You look at both sides, and then at some point you kind of make up your mind. And it's important to keep an open mind, but once your mind is made up, it's much more difficult to take your mind to a different place. No, it's the same thing here. That once your mind is made up, you kind of believe a certain narrative. You kind of buy into a certain narrative, so you begin to look more into that side of it. it's challenging for me because I want to have both sides, but I so strongly believe in this case that it's clear cut that Russia and Ukraine, there's no, Russia is the bad guy, Ukraine is the good guy, if you can say that in this case. But I totally agree. There's always narratives, right? Quite spot on comment on politicians enriching themselves wildly. Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. It's all, every time you look into it, it's wilder in the US because I imagine they have so much influence. So it just gets wilder. Like, there's not a lot of influence in Denmark, because we don't really do anything. We join the US when they tell us to go to war, stupid as we are, but that's about it. Her husband is a venture capitalist trader. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, that's what she made her money on, Pelosi, right? Or is it Clinton? Like, both of them, either way. They all do it in some form or another. They do. Let me see. I brought up bots because there's a heavy pro-Putin push on right-wing videos right now, trying to trick Trump supporters, even though Trump was not in favor of this. This stream is. Listen. I'm really enjoying this. I'm wondering if I should just let's say 2 hours and 10 minutes. That's when we will cut it off. So 10 minutes more, because you have such good questions, and I love you guys on the channel. I love you guys for bringing up all of these comments, and because you bring up such good points. So where was I'm losing track a little bit. Let me see again. Heavy pro-Trump push on right-wing videos. Right. Yeah. I agree with you. I agree because I've seen it myself. We have to be careful. Listen, I'm in Denmark, so calling me right is probably moderate or moderate right to you. But I would say on a global scale, I'm moderate right. We have to be careful on the right that we don't get too influenced by outside forces, and we have to keep our minds with us at all times. Because otherwise we get too influenced by Russian bots or something. Because I notice it as well, that often there's a push for Putin to be a bit more glorified than he deserves. And I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I don't think that Putin is all bad all the time. I think Ukraine invasion is horrible. I think suppression of free press in Russia is horrible, all of that. But I know Russian people who live outside of Russia who strongly supports Putin. They respond well to a guy who has a strong vision, who seems like a strong man and who wants to go places with Russia. I don't agree with a lot of it, but I agree with some parts, like rebuilding the lower class, making sure that you give it a good, decent wage for every. There's a few things that I really agree with, and it's just kind of the same thing with President Xi Jinping in China. I don't agree with almost anything in terms of politics and stuff, but I know that China has been really effective in raising the lower class to a decent living standard. And I know it's not all the way there, but reports I'm reading is that they're getting better and better. So it's always a mixed bag, but we have to be careful. We don't get too influenced. Magic Smoke says, thanks, great show, gotta go. Thank you for joining Magic Smoke. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you. Russia will push the Ukrainian government out, put in place a puppet leader of Moscow, and then demilitarize Ukraine, as they won't be a threat anymore in the future. Yes, yeah, I totally agree, and I agree that you're right, and that looks to be, those news reports came out all over the place that Putin wanted a puppet in place that's more pro-Russian and then absorb them as time goes by. Totally agree. Great discussion. Thanks, Danish guy. This is a free speech in action. Thank you so much, Niels Cook, for commenting and watching the video. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you guys so much. To a lot of people, you know, a few subscribers or a few like people watching your videos is not a lot, but I love that we have 10 people plus here at all times, and we're just talking about this issue. I know it started out super structured, and right now I'm going through the comments. But I really appreciate you guys. You guys are the absolute best. I appreciate it a lot. I agree with Frank. That is very likely. Yeah. Yeah, love this live stream. Thank you so much, Wisco. It means a lot to me. Good stuff. Good stream. Thank you so much for watching, guys. This was really fun. I appreciate everyone watching. I appreciate you guys coming in to comment, to check out the video. It really means a lot to me. Also, hey Benji, he says great stuff. Keep it up. The good work. Benji, I know in real life. So thank you for watching as well, Benji. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really helps me out if you like the video as well. All of those things that you have to say on YouTube, but it helps out with the algorithm. So hit the like button if you haven't done that. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a really good weekend coming up here in just a day.